This is the only hour that ever was or ever will be. For during this hour, you will decide your future and thus our collective futures. You're listening to the Hour of the Time. I'm your host, William Cooper. Is that the kind of world you want for your children and grandchildren? How about for yourself? Well, I can tell you it's not the kind of world that I want for myself or for my children or for my grandchildren or for their children and grandchildren. Although after I'm gone, it will be their duty to pick up the banner and determine their future. But now it's my job to try and make the future for them the best that it can possibly be. You see, I take my responsibility seriously. There is a group of men and women in this country, the United States, and in most of the major countries of the world who belong to secret societies and organizations, many different ones under many different names, and most of these people belong to several of these groups, not just one or two, whose goal is to destroy the sovereignty of nations, destroy all existing religions, place the great mass of people of the world in chains, if not literally, then figuratively, to where they can be controlled for every single moment of every 24-hour period of their life. I'm going to do something tonight no one has ever done before, and once I've done it, you will have a better understanding of what's happening to this country. There are two major organizations in the United States which are working from within to destroy this great nation and bring about a one-world, totalitarian, socialist government. These two organizations are the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and these folks are the major players. The men who make up, and women, who make up the membership of these two organizations also belong to many of the other so-called fraternal organizations existing, quote, for the good of the community, unquote, such as Freemasonry, the Ancient Order of the Rose and Cross, the Knights Templar, the Red Cross of Constantine, the Sovereign and Military Order of the Knights of Malta, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, the Jesuit Order. And I could go on and 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 on. The Round Table Group, the Businessman's Round Table Group. And you have these people at the head of your city government, your state government, your National Guard, our military services, all of them, the federal government, the media, the energy companies, corporate America, both houses of Congress, business and industry leaders, including the heads of the labor unions. If you belong to a labor union and you think they're working for you, well, you're wrong. They're working toward a one-world government, and you are one of the pawns, one of the tools that are getting them there. Colleges and university residents, presidents, and university professors, banks, the entire Federal Reserve System, the Department of State, the ambassadors to foreign countries, the Library of Congress, National Science Foundation, U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Federal Judicial Center, Office of Science and Technology, the Export-Import Bank, Office of Management and Budget, the White House staff, the Treasury Department, Office of Technology Assessment, Environmental Protection Agency, African Development Fund, Office of U.S. Trade Representatives, U.S. Institute for Peace, the entire branch of the judiciary, and every single member of the President's Cabinet, and, of course, the President himself. So here we go, folks. Hang on to your hats. First, I'm going to read you a quote from the book written by Senator Barry Goldwater entitled With No Apologies. And this is just so you'll know that I didn't make this up out of my Good, folks. He says, the Council on Foreign Relations is the American branch of a society which originated in England and believes national boundaries should be obliterated and one world rule established. He also says, the Trilateral Commission is international and is intended to be the vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interests by seizing control of the political government of the United States. Make no mistake, he is absolutely correct. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand that the sources for this information come from, number one, the United States Government Manual 1991 and 92, Office of the Federal Register, National Archives and Records Administration. Number two, Standard & Poor's Register of Corporations, Directors, and Executives for 1991. And number three, Annual Report 1991 and 92, the Council on Foreign Relations, Pratt House, New York City. Credit for this information goes to the Fund to Restore an Educated Electorate, P.O. Box 33339, Kerrville, Texas, 78029. And folks, if you would like to have a copy of this information, send us a self-addressed stamped envelope along with a $5 donation, and we will send you a copy of the information that we are sending out to you over the airwaves tonight. Once again, may I remind you that the hour of the time is the only source of truth left in media in the entire world. If you don't believe that, why haven't you heard this anywhere else? At the top is a man that most people don't know anything about. His name is David Rockefeller. He's the Chairman Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Peter G. Peterson is the Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the address of the Council on Foreign Relations, where you can write to them for information, is 58 East 68th Street, New York, New York, 10021. Again, Peter G. Peterson, Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, 58 East 68th Street, New York, New York, 10021. Paul Volcker is the North American Chairman of the Trilateral Commission. Their address is 345 East 46th Street, New York, New York, 10017. Again, Paul Volcker, North American Chairman of the Trilateral Commission, 345 East 46th Street, New York, New York, 10017. Now, believe it or not, these are the people, along with their directorships, who decide the course of policy and government action in this country. William Clinton, the President of the United States of America, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group, which is an international organization that all of these bodies answer to, specifically to the Policy Committee. William Clinton is also a Rhodes Scholar. His whole history is socialism. A socialist. At a time when no Americans were allowed to travel to Russia, William Clinton took a trip to Moscow to learn firsthand about socialism and communism and how it works. It is unfortunate that the American people have chosen to elect him President of the United States of America. Dick Thornburg, his Assistant Secretary for Administration of the United Nations, is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Anthony Lake, the National Security Advisor, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Albert Gore, Jr., Vice President, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Les Aspin, Secretary of Defense, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Colin L. Powell, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. James Woolsey, Director, Central Intelligence Agency, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Laura Tyson, Chairman, Council of Economic Advisors, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Lloyd Benson, Treasury Secretary, is a member of the Bilderberg Group, the international group, and he is a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also not paid by the United States of America. He receives his paycheck from the International Monetary Fund. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is directly under his control, which means under the control of an international agency which answers directly to the United Nations. Bruce Babbitt, Secretary of Interior, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Henry Cisneros, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Donna Shalala, Secretary of Health and Human Services, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Donna Shalala, while the head president of a university in her home state, issued a memo forbidding all professors, all administrators, all staff, and all students from referring to the men who built this great nation as, quote, our founding fathers, unquote, on pain of punishment of dismissal. Now, I'm going to go directly from the government to the media. It is important that you know why you don't get the real facts, why you don't get the real news, and how you are being brainwashed, and how your children are being brainwashed into accepting the New World Order, into believing that someone who owns a weapon is a terrible, terrible person, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to cover all of these things because it's more important that you know the names of the people who are influencing your lives and giving you the information upon which you base your decisions for the future. Media. CBS. Lawrence A. Tisch, the CEO, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Roswell Gilpatrick, member, Council on Foreign Relations. James Houghton is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Henry Schacht is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Dan Rather is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Hotelet is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Frank Stanton is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. NBC, RCA. John F. Welch, Jr., CEO, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Jane Pfeiffer, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Lester Crystal, member, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. R.W. Sonnenfeld, member, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. John Petty, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Tom Brokaw, member, Council on Foreign Relations. David Brinkley, member, Council on Foreign Relations. John Chancellor, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Marvin Kalb, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Irving R. Levine, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Herbert Schlosser, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Peter G. Peterson, member, Council on Foreign Relations. John Sawhill, member, Council on Foreign Relations. ABC, Thomas S. Murphy, CEO, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Barbara Walters, member, Council on Foreign Relations. John Connor, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Diane Sawyer, member, Council on Foreign Relations. John Scally, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Public Broadcast Service. Robert McNeil, Council on Foreign Relations. Jim Lear, member, Council on Foreign Relations. C. Hunter Galt, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Harding Carter III, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Daniel Shore, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Associated Press. Stanley Swinton, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Harold Anderson, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Catherine Graham, member, Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Reuters. Michael Posner, member, Council on Foreign Relations. The Baltimore Sun. Henry Trewitt, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Washington Times. Arnaud de Borchgrave, member, Council on Foreign Relations. The Children's TV Workshop, the people who bring you Sesame Street. Joan Gans Cooney, president of the Children's Television Workshop, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Have you sat down lately with your children and watched Sesame Street to see exactly what it is that they are teaching your children? Were you aware that there is a character on Sesame Street named H. Ross Perot, whom, like his counterpart in real life, H. Ross Perot, is teaching the children to ask for a constitutional convention? This character on Sesame Street runs around all day long calling conventions, calling conventions, calling conventions. And one of his pet conventions that he wants to call is a constitutional convention. When are you people going to wake up? You think it can't happen in America? It already has. Waco, Texas, proved that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights no longer exist. We don't have much time. Cable News Network. W. Thomas Johnson, President, Trilateral Commission member. Daniel Shore, member, Council on Foreign Relations. U.S. News and World Report. David Gergen, member, Trilateral Commission. New York Times Company. Richard Gelb, member, Council on Foreign Relations. William Scranton, member, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. John F. Akers, director, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Louis B. Gerstner, Jr., member, Council on Foreign Relations. George B. Monroe, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Donald M. Stewart, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Cyrus R. Vance, member, Council on Foreign Relations. And Cyrus R. Vance and the last four that I have names that I have read off to you are also directors. A.M. Rosenthal, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Seymour Topping, member, Council on Foreign Relations. James Greenfield, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Max Frankel, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Jack Rosenthal, member, Council on Foreign Relations. John Oakes, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Harrison Salisbury, member, Council on Foreign Relations. H.L. Smith, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen Ratner, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Burt, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Flora Lewis, member, Trilateral Commission. Time Incorporated. Ralph Davidson, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Donald M. Wilson, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Henry Grunwald, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Alexander Hurd, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Saul Lenowitz, member, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Thomas Watson, Jr., member, Council on Foreign Relations. Strobe Talbot, member, Trilateral Commission. Newsweek and Washington Post. Catherine Graham, member, Council on Foreign Relations. N. D.E.B. Katzenbach, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert Christopher, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Osborne Elliott, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Philip Galen, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Murray Martyr, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Maynard Parker, member, Council on Foreign Relations. George Will, member, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Robert Kaiser, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Meg Greenfield, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Walter Pincus, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Murray Gart, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Peter Osnos, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Don Oberdorfer, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Dow Jones and Company, which publishes the Wall Street Journal. Richard Wood, member, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert Bartley, member, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Karen House, member, Council on Foreign Relations. The National Review. William F. Buckley, Jr., member, Council on Foreign Relations. Reader's Digest. George B. Gruen, CEO, member, Council on Foreign Relations. William G. Bowen, Director, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Syndicated columnists: Georgie Ann Geyer, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Ben J. Wattenberg, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, GE, NBC. John F. Welch, Jr., Chairman, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. David C. Jones, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Louis T. Preston, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Frank H. T. Rhodes, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Walter B. Wriston, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go now to senators and representatives of the United States Congress. Senators: David L. Boren, Democrat, Oklahoma, Member, Council on Foreign Relations. William Bradley, Democrat, New Jersey, Council on Foreign Relations. John H. Chaffee, Republican, Rhode Island, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. William S. Cohen, Republican, Maine, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Christopher J. Dodd, Democrat, Connecticut, Council on Foreign Relations. Dianne Feinstein, Democrat, California, Trilateral Commission. Bob Graham, Democrat, Florida, Council on Foreign Relations. Joseph I. Lieberman, Democrat, Connecticut, Council on Foreign Relations. Michael J. Mitchell, Democrat, Maine, Council on Foreign Relations. Claiborne Pell, Democrat, Rhode Island, Council on Foreign Relations. Larry Pressler, Republican, South Dakota, Council on Foreign Relations. Charles S. Robb, Democrat, Virginia, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. John D. Rockefeller IV, Democrat, West Virginia, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. William Roth, Jr., Republican, Delaware, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. The House of Representatives: Howard L. Berman, Democrat, California, Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas S. Foley, Democrat, Washington, Council on Foreign Relations. Sam Gedgensen, Democrat, Connecticut, Council on Foreign Relations. Richard A. Gephardt, Democrat, Missouri, Council on Foreign Relations. Newton L. Gingrich, Republican, Georgia, Council on Foreign Relations. Oh, Georgia, you should be ashamed of yourself for that man. About every week he introduces a new piece of legislation to strip us of our right to keep and bear arms. And yet, his electorate keeps telling him no, and he keeps introducing such measures, and you keep re-electing him. Lee H. Hamilton, Democrat, Indiana, Trilateral Commission. Amory Houghton, Jr., Republican, New York, Council on Foreign Relations. Nancy Lee Johnson, Republican, Connecticut, Council on Foreign Relations. Jim Leach, Republican, Iowa, Trilateral Commission. John Lewis, Democrat, Georgia, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert T. Matsui, Democrat, California, Council on Foreign Relations. Dave K. McCurdy, Democrat, Oklahoma, Council on Foreign Relations. Eleanor Holmes Norton, Democrat, Washington, D.C., Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas E. Petrie, Republican, Wisconsin, Council on Foreign Relations. Charles B. Rangel, Democrat, New York, Trilateral Commission. Carlos A. Romero Barcelo, Democrat, Puerto Rico, Council on Foreign Relations. Patricia Schroeder, Democrat, Colorado, Council on Foreign Relations. Peter Smith, Republican, Vermont, Council on Foreign Relations. Olympia J. Snow, Republican, Maine, Council on Foreign Relations. John M. Spratt, Democrat, South Carolina, Council on Foreign Relations. Louis Stokes, Democrat, Ohio, Council on Foreign Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're beginning to get the message. Now listen to the Federal Reserve System, past and present, and this is only a partial listing of the Federal Reserve System. Alan Greenspan, Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. E. Gerald Corrigan, Vice Chairman, President, New York Federal Reserve Bank, Council on Foreign Relations. Richard N. Cooper, Chairman, Boston, Council on Foreign Relations. Sam Y. Cross, Manager, Foreign Open Market Account, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert F. Erburu, Chairman, San Francisco, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert P. Forrestal, President, Atlanta, Council on Foreign Relations. Bobby R. Inman, Chairman, Dallas, Council of Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. And when I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, Bobby R. Inman was one of my supervisors. He went on to be the Director of Naval Intelligence and then the Director of the National Security Agency. Robert H. Knight, Esquire, Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen Mueller, Council on Foreign Relations. John R. Opal, Council on Foreign Relations. Anthony M. Solomon, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Edwin M. Truman, Staff Director, International Finance, Council on Foreign Relations. Cyrus R. Vance, Council on Foreign Relations. Paul Volcker, Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. It's time for our break, folks. Don't go away. I'll be right back after this very short pause.
And the world you live for.
Is that the world you want for yourself, your children, and your grandchildren? It's not my vision of the future world, I can assure you. General Motors Corporation. Marina B.N. Whitman, Vice President, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Ann L. Armstrong, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Marvin L. Goldberger, Council on Foreign Relations. Edmund T. Pratt, Jr., Council on Foreign Relations. Dennis Weatherstone, Council on Foreign Relations. Leon H. Sullivan, Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas H. Wyman, Council on Foreign Relations. Ford Motor Company. Clifton R. Wharton, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Roberto C. Goizuda, Council on Foreign Relations, also a Director. Chrysler Corporation. Joseph A. Califano, Jr., Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Peter A. Magawan, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. American Express Company. James D. Robinson, CEO, Council on Foreign Relations. Joan Edelman Sparrow, Trilateral Commission. Ann L. Armstrong, Council on Foreign Relations. William G. Bowen, Council on Foreign Relations. Charles W. Duncan, Jr., Council on Foreign Relations. Richard M. Furloud, Council on Foreign Relations. Vernon E. Jordan, Jr., Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Henry A. Kissinger, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Frank P. Popoff, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert V. Russa, Council on Foreign Relations. Joseph H. Williams, Council on Foreign Relations. American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T. Robert E. Allen, Chairman and CEO, Council on Foreign Relations. Randall L. Tobias, Vice Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. Louis B. Gerstner, Director, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Juanita M. Krebs, Council on Foreign Relations. Donald M. McHenry, Council on Foreign Relations. Henry B. Schacht, Council on Foreign Relations. Michael I. Soburn, Council on Foreign Relations. Franklin A. Thomas, Council on Foreign Relations. Rowley Warner, Jr., Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas H. Wyman, Council on Foreign Relations, and all names that I read to you of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company are all on the Board of Directors. Amtrak. William S. Norman, Executive Vice President, Council on Foreign Relations. IBM, International Business Machines. John F. Akers, Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. C. Michael Armstrong, Senior Vice President, Council on Foreign Relations. Deere and Company, as in John Deere. Hans W. Beckerer, Chairman and CEO, Council on Foreign Relations. Tenneco Incorporated, James L. Kettleson, Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. W. Michael Blumenthal, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Joseph J. Sisko, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Mobile Corporation, Alan E. Murray, Chairman and President, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Louis M. Branscombe, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Samuel C. Johnson, Director, Trilateral Commission. Helen L. Kaplan, Council on Foreign Relations, also a Director. Charles S. Sanford, Jr., Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Shell Oil Company, Frank H. Richardson, CEO, Council on Foreign Relations. Rand V. Araskog, Director, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Atlantic Richfield, ARCO. Hannah H. Gray, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Donald M. Kendall, Director, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Henry Wendt, Director, Trilateral Commission. Texaco. Alfred C. DeCrane, Jr., Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. John Bradamus, Director, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Willard C. Butcher, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. William J. Crow, Jr., Director, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. John K. McKinley, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas F. Murphy, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Exxon Corporation. Lawrence G. Rawl, Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. Lee R. Raymond, President, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Jack G. Clark, Sr., Vice President, Council on Foreign Relations. Randolph W. Bromery, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. D. Wayne Calloway, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. And now we're going to go back to the government for just a little while, folks. In the judiciary, Sandra Day O'Connor, Associate Justice, United States Supreme Court, Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen G. Breyer, Chief Judge, United States Court of Appeals, First Circuit Court, Boston, Council on Foreign Relations. Ruth B. Ginsburg, United States Court of Appeals, Washington, D.C. Circuit Court, Council on Foreign Relations, and you know where she is now, don't you? Lawrence H. Silberman, United States Court of Appeals, Washington, D.C. Circuit Judge, Council on Foreign Relations. That's just a partial listing. We didn't even get into the Justice Department at all. We did a sample survey also, folks, and if the results of our survey are correct, then over 90% of all judges in this country are also Freemasons, who protect all other Freemasons and work toward their goal of a one-world government. The new order, the new age, the new root race. In the United States Institute for Peace, John Norton Moore, Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. Elspeth Davies Rostow, Vice Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. Samuel W. Lewis, President, Council on Foreign Relations. John Richardson, Counselor, Council on Foreign Relations. David Little, Senior Scholar, Council on Foreign Relations. William R. Kittner, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. W. Scott Thompson, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. In the Office of United States Trade Representation, Gary R. Edson, Chairman of Staff and Counselor, Council on Foreign Relations. Joshua Bolton, General Counsel, Council on Foreign Relations. Daniel M. Price, Deputy General Counsel, Council on Foreign Relations. Treasury Department. Roger Altman, Deputy Secretary, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert R. Glauber, Undersecretary, Finance, Council on Foreign Relations. David C. Mulford, Undersecretary for International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert M. Vestani, Deputy Assistant Secretary, International Monetary Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. J. French Hill, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Corporate Finance, Council on Foreign Relations. John M. Niehaus, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. And you might ask yourself, folks, what the Treasury Department has to do with corporate financing. And you already heard that Lloyd Benson is a member of the international control group called the Bilderberg Group and is a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Office of Technology Assessment, Joshua Lederberg, Vice Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. John H. Gibbons, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Louis M. Branscombe, Advisory Council, Council on Foreign Relations. The Environmental Protection Agency, James M. Strock, Assistant Administrator, Enforcement and Compliance, Council on Foreign Relations. The African Development Fund, Leonard H. Robinson, Jr., President, Council on Foreign Relations. On the White House staff, now this is the White House staff, George Stephanopoulos, Director of Communications, Council on Foreign Relations. William J. Crow, Chief Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. Nancy Soderberg, Staff Director, National Security Council, Council on Foreign Relations. Samuel R. Berger, Deputy Advisor, National Security, Council on Foreign Relations. W. Bowman Cutter, Deputy Assistant, National Economic Council, Council on Foreign Relations. The Office of Management and Budget, Alice Rivlin, Deputy Director, Council on Foreign Relations. The Import-Export Bank, or I should say the Export-Import Bank, John D. McCumber, President and Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. Eugene K. Lawson, First Vice President and Vice Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. Rita M. Rodriguez, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Hart Fessenden, General Counsel, Council on Foreign Relations. Office of Science and Technology, William R. Graham, Jr., Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the Science Advisor to the President and Director. We're going now to the Library of Congress. James H. Billington, Librarian, Chairman, Trust Fund Board, Council on Foreign Relations. Ruth Ann Stewart, Assistant Librarian, National Programs, Council on Foreign Relations. National Science Foundation. Frank H.T. Rhodes, Board of Directors, Council on Foreign Relations. James B. Holderman, Board of Directors, Council on Foreign Relations. D. Allen Bromley, Board of Directors, Council on Foreign Relations. United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Thomas Graham, Jr., General Counsel, Council on Foreign Relations. William Schneider, Chairman, General Advisory Council, Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Burke, Negotiator on Strategic Defense Arms, Council on Foreign Relations. David Smith, Negotiator, Defense and Space, Council on Foreign Relations. And the Federal Judicial Center, William W. Swartzer, Director, Council on Foreign Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, there's an awful lot more here. For those of you out there who think that labor is doing you good, let me enlighten you. Labor union leaders. Labor union leaders. J. Mazur, International Ladies Garment Workers Union, Council on Foreign Relations, and Trilateral Commission. Jack Schneikman, Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, Council on Foreign Relations. Albert Shanker, President, American Federation of Teachers, Council on Foreign Relations, and Trilateral Commission. And there's one of the answers why our educational system has been failing. That's just a small part of it. There's a lot more. Glenn E. Watts, Communications Workers of America, Council on Foreign Relations, and Trilateral Commission. United States Military, Department of Defense, Les Aspin, Secretary of Defense, Council on Foreign Relations. Frank G. Wisnerl, Undersecretary for Policy, Council on Foreign Relations. Henry S. Rowan, Assistant Secretary, International Security Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations. Judy Ann Miller, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Manpower, Council on Foreign Relations. Franklin C. Miller, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Nuclear Forces and Arms Control, Council on Foreign Relations. W. Bruce Weinrod, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Europe and NATO, Council on Foreign Relations. Admiral Seymour Weiss, Chairman, Defense Policy Board, Council on Foreign Relations. Charles M. Hersfield, Director, Defense Research and Engineering, Council on Foreign Relations. Andrew W. Marshall, Director, Net Assessment, Council on Foreign Relations. Michael P.W. Stone, Secretary of the Army, Council on Foreign Relations. Donald B. Rice, Secretary of the Air Force, Council on Foreign Relations. Allied Supreme Commanders, then and now. Eisenhower, Council on Foreign Relations. Ridgeway, Council on Foreign Relations. Grunther, Council on Foreign Relations. Norstad, Council on Foreign Relations. Limnitzer, Council on Foreign Relations. Goodpaster, Council on Foreign Relations. Alexander Haig, Council on Foreign Relations. Rogers, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Superintendents of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Westmoreland, Council on Foreign Relations. Lampert, Council on Foreign Relations. Bennett, Council on Foreign Relations. Knowlton, Council on Foreign Relations. Berry, Council on Foreign Relations. Goodpaster, Council on Foreign Relations. Military Fellows of the Council on Foreign Relations. Colonel William M. Drannon, Jr., United States Air Force. Colonel Wallace C. Gregson, United States Marine Corps. Colonel Jack B. Wood, United States Army. CFR Military Fellows of 1992, Colonel David M. Mize, United States Marine Corps. Colonel John P. Rose, United States Army. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin L. Powell, Chairman, Council on Foreign Relations. General Carl E. Buono, Army, Council on Foreign Relations. General John T. Chain, Commander of Strategic Air Command, Council on Foreign Relations. General Merrill A. McPeak, Commander Pacific Air Force, Commander on Foreign Relations. Lieutenant General George L. Butler, Director Strategic Plans and Policy, Commander Council on Foreign Relations. Lieutenant General Charles T. Boyd, Council on Foreign Relations. He's the commander of the Air University. Lieutenant General Bradley C. Hosmer, Air Force Inspector General, Council on Foreign Relations. Secretaries of Defense, then and now, McElroy, Council on Foreign Relations. Gates, Council on Foreign Relations. McNamara, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Laird, Council on Foreign Relations. Richardson, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Rumsfeld, Council on Foreign Relations. Brown, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Weinberger, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Carlucci, Council on Foreign Relations. Cheney, Council on Foreign Relations. Additional military we won't go into because we're running out of time. University professors. Graham Allison, Professor of Government, Harvard University, Trilateral Commission. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Professor, Johns Hopkins, Trilateral Commission, and you should read every book that he ever wrote. This man is a screaming Marxist and was the National Security Advisor to President Carter. Gerald L. Curtis, Professor, Political Science, Columbia University, Trilateral Commission. Martin S. Feldstein, Professor, Economy, Harvard University, Trilateral Commission. Richard N. Gardner, Professor, Law, Columbia University, Trilateral Commission. Joseph S. Nye, Jr., Professor, International Affairs, Harvard University, Trilateral Commission. Robert D. Putnam, Professor, Politics, Harvard University, Trilateral Commission. Henry Rossovsky, Professor, Harvard University, Trilateral Commission. George P. Schultz, Honorary Fellow, Stanford University, Trilateral Commission. Lester C. Thurl, Dean, Sloan School of Management, MIT, Trilateral Commission. Paul Volcker, Professor, International Economics, Princeton University, Trilateral Commission. College and university presidents, and here's the key to the political correctness and the Marxism that's being taught in all of our colleges. These people are traitors. Everyone whose name I have read off tonight is a traitor. Should be hung by their neck until dead after being lawfully convicted in a court of law. Robert H. Edwards, Bedouin College, Council on Foreign Relations. Vartan Gregorian, Brown University, Council on Foreign Relations. Hannah Holborn Gray, University of Chicago, Council on Foreign Relations. Joseph S. Murphy, City University of New York, Council on Foreign Relations. Michael I. Sovern, Columbia University, Council on Foreign Relations. Frank H. T. Rhodes, Cornell University, Council on Foreign Relations. James T. Laney, Emory University, Council on Foreign Relations. Reverend Joseph A. O'Hare, Fordham University, Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas Ehrlich, Indiana University, Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen Mueller, Johns Hopkins University, Council on Foreign Relations. Alice S. Ilkman, Sarah Lawrence College, Council on Foreign Relations. Edward T. Foote, II, University of Miami, Council on Foreign Relations. S. Frederick Starr, Oberlin College, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Joseph Duffy, Chancellor, University of Massachusetts, Council on Foreign Relations. John M. Deutsch, Institute Professor, MIT, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Lester C. Thorough, Dean, Sloan School, MIT, Council on Foreign Relations. Bernard Harlison, City College of New York, Council on Foreign Relations. John Bradamus, New York University, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Wesley W. Posver, University of Pittsburgh, Council on Foreign Relations. Harold T. Shapiro, Princeton University, Council on Foreign Relations. Charles W. Duncan, Jr., Chairman, Rice University, Council on Foreign Relations. Dennis O'Brien, University of Rochester, Council on Foreign Relations. David Baltimore, Rockefeller University, Council on Foreign Relations. Donald Kennedy, Stanford University, Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Wall Lyman, President, EM, Stanford, Council on Foreign Relations. Hans M. Mark, Chancellor, University of Texas, Council on Foreign Relations. Robert H. Donaldson, University of Tulsa, Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen J. Trachtenberg, George Washington University, Council on Foreign Relations. William H. Danforth, Washington University, St. Louis, Council on Foreign Relations. John D. Wilson, Washington and Lee University, Council on Foreign Relations. Nannery O. Keohane, Wellesley University, Council on Foreign Relations. And there's much, much more. We didn't even get into the Department of State and all of the ambassadors and our representatives to the United Nations. We didn't get into business and industry leaders. We did not even touch all of the heads of banks and boards of directors of banks such as Chase Manhattan, Chemical, Citicorp, First City Bank Corp, Texas, Morgan Guarantee, Bankers Trust, New York Corporation, First National Bank of Chicago, Manufacturers, Hanover Directors, Bank of America, Securities and Exchange Commission, etc. And there are many, many more. Take this information, folks, and start kicking some butt and do it right now. If you would like the complete list of all of these people, including the ones we didn't have time to read, send a self-addressed, stamped, number 10 envelope along with a $5 donation to the address you will hear at the end of this program. Good night, and God bless each and every one of you.